I tracked Bigfoot deep into the Appalachian forest, but then it went wrong. At first, I thought it was just another hunting trip. Quiet ridges, heavy fog, the same old trails I've walked 100 times before. But then I saw the tracks barefoot. Huge, pressed deep into the soil where no human could have walked. The deeper I followed, the stranger it got. The woods went silent, like the forest itself was holding its breath. A single knock echoed through the trees, and the air filled with a musky odor I couldn't explain. My trail cam even caught a blurred figure, massive, moving just out of range. That was the moment I realized I wasn't tracking it anymore. Something was leading me straight into its territory. Why did I keep going when every sign told me to turn back? And what was waiting for me at the end of that trail? Your time here matters. Choosing stillness in a busy world makes you one of us. Thanks for being here. I've spent most of my adult life tracking things that don't want to be found. 20 years in the Army taught me how to read the land, how to spot the subtle signs that something's passed through. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what I encountered in the Tennessee mountains back in 90-8. My name is Daniel Price. I'm recording this account because people deserve to know what's out there, even if most won't believe it. I've kept quiet about this for long enough. It was early October when I parked my truck at the ranger station near Mountain City, Tennessee. The morning air had that crisp fall bite to it, and the maples were just starting to turn crimson along the ridgelines. I'd chosen this particular stretch of the Appalachians carefully, remote enough to test my skills, but with enough game trails and natural corridors to make tracking worthwhile. The pack I shouldered that morning contained only the essentials: my journal, topographical maps, compass, first aid kit, enough dried food for 10 days, water filtration, and basic survival gear. My Winchester Model 70 was more habit than necessity. I'd rarely needed it except for the occasional snake or coyote. The trail camera was a new addition, something I'd started carrying to document interesting tracks or wildlife behavior. The rangers had given me the usual warnings about bears and changing weather patterns, but I'd been doing this long enough to know the risks. What I didn't tell them was that I wasn't just there to test my tracking skills. There had been reports, nothing official mind you, but the kind of stories that circulate in small-town diners and general stores. Missing livestock, strange prints, sounds that didn't belong. The first few miles followed an old logging road, before branching off into what the locals called the deep country. The forest here felt different from other parts of the Appalachians I'd explored. The trees were older, their trunks massive and gnarled with age. Rhododendron thickets created natural walls between the ridges, and the ground was carpeted with a thick layer of leaves that muffled my footsteps. I made notes in my journal as I hiked, documenting bearings and landmarks. October 3, 1998. Weather clear, temperature approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Moving northeast along Primary Ridge. Old growth forest, minimal human activity evident. Ground conditions ideal for tracking. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 12 miles and found a suitable campsite near a small creek. The spot offered good visibility and multiple escape routes. Old habits die hard. As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this forest was off. Maybe it was the way the birds would suddenly go quiet, or how the shadows seemed to move differently in the understory. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that every forest has its own personality, its own rhythm. But this place, it felt like walking into a cathedral where the sermon never ended. The trees weren't just old. They felt ancient, like they remembered things from before we had words for them. In my journal that evening, I wrote, "Site secured." At coordinates marked on map. Elevation approximately 3,000 feet. Notable absence of normal forest sounds during dusk hours. Will establish baseline activity patterns over next few days. What I didn't write down was how much this place reminded me of certain valleys in Afghanistan, areas where the locals wouldn't go, places they said belonged to things older than their stories. I'd always dismissed those tales as superstition, but sitting there in the gathering dark, watching the shadows lengthen between those ancient trees, I found myself wondering what else those mountain people might have been right about. I ate a simple dinner of dried meat and trail mix, then spent some time reviewing my maps by headlamp. The area ahead was largely unmarked, except for basic topography, the kind of blank space that drew me to this region in the first place. Tomorrow, I planned to push deeper into the valley, following game trails and looking for signs of whatever had been spooking the local farmers' livestock. Before turning in, I made one final note: no unusual signs observed. We'll begin systematic grid search at first light. Looking back now, I realize how naive those words were. I had no idea that I wasn't the one doing the tracking. Dawn broke clear and cold on October 4th. I broke camp efficiently, decades of military routine guiding my movements. The forest felt different in the morning light, less imposing, more familiar. This was the kind of work that always centered me, gave my mind something solid to focus on instead of dwelling on other things. I headed northeast, following the natural contours of the land. In the Army, we learned to read terrain like a book. Every fold, every drainage pattern tells a story. The valleys here ran mostly north-south, carved by ancient waters long before anyone thought to draw maps of this place. My boots crunched through the autumn leaves, and I found myself falling into the old rhythm. 5 steps, pause, scan. 5 more steps. The morning passed quietly as I worked my way higher into the border country. Around 1100 hours, I stopped to check my bearings and make notes. The air was getting thinner, and the forest was changing character. The oaks and maples were giving way to spruce and hemlock, their branches draped with old man's beard lichen. This was proper wilderness, the kind of place where you could walk for days without crossing another human trail. Elevation approximately 4,000 feet, I wrote in my journal. Terrain transitioning to older growth forest. Ground cover sparse under evergreens, tracking conditions variable. I'd been following game trails, noting the usual signs: deer browse, turkey scratching, the occasional bear mark on a tree. Everything normal, everything expected. Until it wasn't. The first sign came just after noon, in a patch of soft earth near a seep. I almost walked past it, but 20 years of tracking made me stop. There, pressed into the mud, was something that didn't fit. The impression was roughly foot-shaped, but the proportions were wrong. Wider than any human print I'd seen, with a flatter profile. The toes, if that's what they were, seemed spread wider than normal, like they were designed for gripping uneven ground. My first thought was bear, but I'd seen enough bear tracks to know this wasn't right. The weight distribution was all wrong, and there was something about the way it pressed into the ground that suggested bipedal movement. I took out my notebook and made a careful sketch, including measurements and noting the soil composition. Unusual track observed at 1300 hours, I wrote. Length, 15 inches. Width at ball of foot, 7 inches. Depth suggests subject weight exceeding 300 pounds. No clear ridge patterns visible in impression. Subject appears to have been moving northeast along game trail. I tried to follow the trail, but the ground quickly turned rocky, and the signs faded. That's when the training kicked in, the voice of my old tracking instructor. When the trail goes cold, expand your search pattern. Look for secondary signs. I spent the next hour working in a grid pattern around the area, looking for anything else out of place. Found a few broken branches higher up than deer could reach, but nothing conclusive. Part of me wanted to dismiss the whole thing, write it off as a weather-worn bear track or maybe some hunter playing games. But another part, the part that had kept me alive in places where being wrong meant not coming home, kept nagging at me. Possible alternative explanations, I continued in my journal. Ursus americanus with unusual gait. Human with modified footwear. Natural ground depression enhanced by water flow. Even as I wrote the words, I knew I was trying to convince myself. The sun was past its peak when I finally moved on, following the ridge northeast. I'd marked the location on my map and taken several photos with my trail camera, though I didn't expect much from them given the lighting conditions. Standard procedure: document everything, assume nothing. That night, setting up camp 3 miles from the print site, I found myself returning to those measurements in my journal. 15 inches long, 7 inches wide. The numbers wouldn't add up to anything I recognized, no matter how I tried to make them fit. I chose my campsite carefully, following the protocols that had become second nature over the years. High ground, good sight lines, multiple exit routes, basic survival thinking. The spot I found was tucked against a natural stone outcropping that would block the wind and reflect heat from my small fire. As I went through my evening routine, I noticed how the forest seemed to be holding its breath. The silence crept in gradually at first. The late afternoon bird chorus thinned out, then stopped altogether. No more chickadees chattering in the hemlocks, no woodpeckers working the dead snags. Even the squirrels, which had been busy all day preparing for winter, had gone quiet. In 20 years of wilderness experience, I'd learned that when the small things go silent, the big things are moving. I kept my movements deliberate and quiet as I set up camp, my senses alert for anything unusual. That's when I caught it, a peculiar odor riding the evening breeze. Musky, almost sweet, but with an undertone I couldn't quite place. Not bear, I knew that smell well enough. This was different, more primal somehow. It reminded me of the time our unit tracked a tiger in Southeast Asia, but even that wasn't quite right. October 4th, 1998, 1900 hours, I wrote in my journal. Sudden cessation of bird activity noted. Ambient temperature 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind from northwest at approximately 5 miles per hour. Unusual olfactory signature detected, possibly marking behavior from unidentified large mammal. I kept my fire small that night, just enough to heat water for coffee and warm my evening meal. Military habits die hard, no sense advertising. My position more than necessary. The darkness settled in thick under the canopy, and I found myself straining to identify every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth. At 2300 hours, I was about to turn in when I heard it. A sharp, distinct knock echoed through the valley, the unmistakable sound of wood striking wood. Once, then silence. I'd heard similar sounds before, usually from dead branches falling or trees settling in the cold. But this was different. The sound had a deliberate quality to it, like someone testing the acoustics of the valley. I waited, pen hovering over my journal, for a response or repetition. Nothing came. Just that absolute silence that had descended earlier, as if the forest itself was listening. Single wood knock recorded at 2300 hours, I wrote. Duration, approximately 0.5 seconds. Direction, northeast. Estimated distance 500 to 700 yards. No secondary sounds detected. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through tracking school and countless wilderness operations, started listing explanations. Deadwood falling. Bears stripping bark. Maybe even other campers, though I hadn't seen signs of any. But another part of my mind, the part that recognizes patterns and reads sign, kept circling back to that oversized print I'd found earlier. I checked my rifle, more out of habit than genuine concern. The familiar weight of the bolt-action Remington was reassuring. Not that I intended to use it. I'd learned long ago that most threats in the wilderness could be avoided simply by being alert and making smart decisions. Sleep came in fits and starts that night. Every time I'd begin to drift off, some small sound would bring me fully alert. The fire died to coals, and the October chill crept in. I kept thinking about that knock, trying to place it in my catalog of wilderness sounds. It wasn't like anything in my experience, and that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. In my journal, just before finally falling asleep, I made one. Last note: multiple rational explanations exist for today's observations. Maintain objective perspective. Additional data required before drawing conclusions. The words looked solid and reasonable on the page, but they didn't quite quiet the unease that had settled into my gut, the feeling that something out there was operating just outside the edges of my understanding. I woke before dawn, my military habits still dictating my schedule after all these years. As I broke camp, those tracks from yesterday kept nagging at my thoughts. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss them, but the tracker in me saw them as a puzzle that needed solving. 0500 hours, October 5th, I recorded in my journal. Temperature 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Light ground frost. setting out to backtrack signs from yesterday. I shouldered my pack and started working my way back to where I'd first spotted those unusual depressions. The morning dew helped. It darkened the disturbed earth where something heavy had passed. The tracks led northeast, following the natural contours of the land. Whatever had made them seemed to favor the path of least resistance. Just like any other large animal would dot around mid-morning, I found myself climbing a steep ridge. The tracking got harder here, less soft earth, more rock and fallen leaves, but there were other signs. About 8 feet up a hickory tree, I noticed fresh bark damage. The break pattern wasn't consistent with bear activity. Bears tend to leave vertical claw marks. This looked more like something had gripped and twisted. 1,000 hours, I wrote. Observed unusual bark damage on mature hickory. Break pattern. Suggests application of significant rotational force at 8-foot height. No claw marks visible. The trail led me through a dense patch of mountain laurel. Here, the signs became more obvious. Something big had pushed through, snapping branches as thick as my thumb. What caught my attention was the height, consistently around 7 to 8 feet off the ground. Bears moving through laurel thickets leave a much lower tunnel of broken vegetation. I kept moving, marking waypoints in my journal and taking compass bearings. The terrain was getting rougher, but the sign was still there if you knew how to read it. Around noon I stopped to eat and found something interesting. Fresh scat, still warm enough to steam in the cool air. 1,200 hours. Located scat deposit, approximately 12 inches in length, 4 inches diameter. Contents include partially masticated American chestnut hulls and what appears to be vegetable matter. Texture and composition unlike typical bear scat. The chestnuts interested me. The old American chestnut trees were mostly gone from these mountains, killed off by blight decades ago. But there were still a few isolated survivors, and something had found them. The hulls were crushed and torn in a way that suggested powerful jaws, but the pattern was different from bear sign I'd seen before. I continued following the trail through the afternoon. Each sign I found could be explained away individually. Broken branches could be from storm damage, tracks could be overlapping bear prints, scat could be from any large omnivore. But together, they formed a pattern that didn't quite fit anything I'd encountered in my years of tracking. 1,500 hours, following sign across third ridgeline. Pattern suggests deliberate movement rather than random foraging. Subject appears to be maintaining consistent heading of 0.45 degrees. The sun was getting low when I found a small clearing littered with chestnut hulls. The ground showed signs of recent activity, multiple depressions in the soft earth, similar to the tracks I'd first spotted. But these were fresher, and the detail was better preserved. I took careful measurements and sketched them in my journal. 1,700 hours, located possible feeding area. Multiple track impressions. Largest measures 17 inches length, 8 inches width at ball of foot. Depth suggests subject weight in excess of 500 pounds. Stride length approximately 52 inches. I wanted to continue, but daylight was fading fast. The sensible move would be to make camp and resume tracking tomorrow. As I searched for a suitable site, I couldn't shake the feeling that each piece of evidence I'd found today was like a puzzle piece that almost, but not quite, fit into my understanding of these mountains and what lived in them. I found a decent camping spot just before sunset, nestled against a rock face that would block the wind. The temperature was dropping fast, typical for October in these mountains. As I set up my tent, I kept glancing at my pack where the trail camera waited. I'd brought it mainly to document any unusual wildlife patterns, but now those tracks had me curious. 1,900 hours, I wrote in my journal. Setting up camp at coordinates ... double quotes. I paused, double-checking my GPS. 35 degrees, 42 minutes north, 83 degrees, 15 minutes west. Elevation, 3,200 feet. The camera was a new model, nothing fancy but reliable enough for basic wildlife monitoring. I'd used similar ones during my Army days for surveillance. This one had infrared capability and could capture decent night shots up to about 40 feet. I spent a few minutes testing the batteries and checking the settings. Testing trail camera placement, I noted. Primary field of view covers game trail intersection approximately 30 feet from camp. Camera positioned 4 feet high on maple trunk, oriented north-northeast. I secured the camera with a cable lock, more out of habit than necessity. This deep in the backcountry. The evening settled in quickly, bringing that peculiar mountain silence that seems to amplify every small sound. I heated my dinner and tried to focus on my journal entries from the day, but my mind kept wandering back to those tracks. 2100 hours, reviewing day's observations. Track patterns suggest. I stopped writing, realizing I was starting to theorize rather than simply record. That wasn't like me. I'd always prided myself on sticking to facts, but something about today's findings had gotten under my skin. A sharp crack from the darkness made me freeze. It sounded like a branch breaking, but too thick to be random forest noise. I clicked off my headlamp and waited, listening. Nothing followed except the soft whisper of wind through the trees out around midnight. I was still awake when the camera's infrared flash triggered. I debated checking it immediately, but decided against breaking. Camp protocol. Movement at night usually meant curious bears or deer. Nothing worth losing sleep over. At first light, I was already up and retrieving the memory card. My hands were steady, they always are, but there was an unfamiliar tension in my gut. As I slipped the card into my digital viewer. 0500 hours, October 6th, I wrote. Reviewing night footage from trail camera. Multiple deer captures between 2100 and 2300 hours. One possible bear at 0200 hours. Then I saw it. The timestamp showed 0315 hours. The image was mostly dark, except for a massive blur at the frame's edge. Whatever it was stood well above the reference marks I'd placed on the trees, easily over 7 feet tall. The infrared flash had caught what looked like dense hair or fur, but the subject had moved too quickly for a clear capture. 0315 hours capture shows large subject, I recorded, trying to maintain my usual clinical tone. Estimated. Height 7 to 8 feet based on reference points. Subject in motion, creating significant motion blur. Initial assessment suggests possible bear on hind legs, though positioning and movement pattern appear atypical. I stared at the image longer than I should have. The rational explanation was right there. Bears stand up all the time, and motion. Blur can make anything look strange. But something about the proportions nagged at me. Bears have a distinctive shoulder hump when upright. This blur showed a more human-like outline. Additional notes, I wrote, then hesitated. My pen hovered over the page. Finally I added, subject profile inconsistent with typical ursine posture, possibility of ... I crossed out the last part. Best to stick to what I could prove, I packed. Up camp methodically, but my usual efficiency was off. I kept glancing at the tree line, measuring heights in my mind against what I'd seen in that photo. The morning felt different somehow, the forest less familiar, as if overnight it had shifted slightly out of alignment with what I thought I knew about these mountains. The blurred photo was stored safely in my camera now, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Years of tracking had taught me to trust my instincts, but they'd also taught me the danger of jumping to conclusions. Right now, those two lessons were at war with each other. I broke camp early, double-checking my compass before heading deeper into the mountains. The morning fog clung to the valleys below, but up here the air was crisp and clear. My pack felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the weight of that blurred photo still on my mind. 0700 hours, October 6th, I wrote in my journal. Continuing northeast along ridge. Weather clear, temperature approximately 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The first odd arrangement caught my eye about 2 hours in. 3 saplings, each about wrist thick, had been bent into an arch over a narrow game trail. At first, I dismissed it as storm damage, but closer inspection revealed something deliberate about it. The trees hadn't been broken, they'd been carefully bent and woven together at the top. 0900 hours. Observed unusual vegetation formation, I noted. 3 eastern hemlock saplings, approximately 2 inches in diameter, bent to form crude archway. Height 6 feet, 4 inches. No visible tool marks or binding material. Recent growth suggests manipulation occurred within past season. My military training kicked in as I documented the site. I took measurements, sketched the formation, and photographed it from multiple angles. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Maybe local kids had done it, though I was miles from the nearest trail. Bears sometimes bend saplings, but this showed too much precision. As I pressed on, I began noticing more signs. Subtle at first, broken branches. At consistent heights, worn paths that seemed to connect these arch formations. I'd tracked game all over these mountains, but this was different. This felt intentional. 1100 hours. Located second arch formation, similar construction. Distance from first marker, approximately 1.2 miles. Notable, consistent height and construction method. Direction appears to indicate. I stopped writing. Was I really starting to think these were markers, trail signs? The idea seemed absurd, yet my instincts, the same ones that had kept me alive in combat zones, were screaming that I was following something's path. The forest had changed character too. The usual background chorus of birds and small animals had grown sporadic, creating pockets of unnatural silence. Every so often, I'd catch that musky scent again, stronger now. It reminded me of wet fur, but earthier, more primitive. 1300 hours, third arch located, pattern emerging. Formations appear to lead northeast, roughly parallel to ridgeline. Terrain becoming steeper, more remote. I paused to eat some trail mix and check my bearings. The sun was high now, filtering through the canopy in sharp beams. As I studied my map, a sensation crept over me, that peculiar awareness of being watched. In the Army, we called it target lock, when you can feel eyes on you but can't spot the observer. I scanned the trees slowly, methodically, the way I'd been trained. Nothing moved except shadows and leaves in the wind. But the feeling persisted. 1330 hours. Note, significant decrease in wildlife activity. No bird calls for past 45 minutes. Air pressure stable. No approaching weather system to explain behavioral change. The next arch I found was larger, nearly 8 feet tall. The saplings used were thicker too, requiring considerable strength to bend. What struck me most was how the surrounding vegetation had been cleared, not haphazardly, but in a way that created clear sight lines along the path it seemed to mark. 1500 hours. Fourth formation located. Construction shows increased sophistication. Ground around structure shows signs of regular passage. Multiple track impressions in soft soil, similar to those documented previously. I photographed everything, maintaining my professional demeanor in my notes. But my hand shook slightly as I wrote, and I caught myself checking over my shoulder more frequently. The forest seemed to be funneling me forward, each arch leading to the next like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale, only this was no fairy tale. These mountains held secrets, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover them. But I kept going, my tracker's instincts warring with growing apprehension. The trail was too clear now to ignore, even if every step felt like it was being anticipated by something unseen. I made camp as the sun began to sink behind the ridgeline. The temperature was dropping fast, typical for October in these mountains. My hands moved through the familiar motions of setting up my tent and gathering firewood, but my mind kept drifting to those arch formations. They'd stopped appearing about 2 miles back, but I couldn't shake the feeling they'd led me somewhere specific. 1800 hours, I wrote in my journal. Camp established in small valley between 2 ridges. Elevation approximately 3,000 feet. Limited visibility due to dense forest cover. The valley was narrow, maybe half a mile across, with steep walls that disappeared into the growing darkness. I'd chosen a spot near a small stream, remembering my training about defensive positions. Always keep water nearby, maintain clear sight lines where possible. But here, the trees pressed close, their branches creating deep shadows that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. I had just finished my dinner of beef jerky and dried fruit when I heard it. A sharp, deliberate knock, like stone striking stone, echoing across the valley. I froze, my hand instinctively moving to my rifle. 1845 hours. Single percussive sound detected. Origin, Northwest Ridge, estimated distance 400 yards. Another knock followed, then another. The rhythm was steady, almost mechanical in its precision. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. It wasn't random, couldn't be random. In all my years in these mountains, I'd never heard anything like it. My training kicked in as I analyzed the sound. Too regular for falling rocks, too loud for woodpeckers, too deliberate for natural causes. The knocks were moving, tracking along the ridge in an arc that seemed to mirror my position. 1900 hours, I whispered as I wrote. Multiple percussive sounds continuing. Pattern suggests ... double quotes. The knock stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against my ears like a physical force. I realized I'd been whispering my notes aloud as I wrote them, a habit from my tracking days. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Testing response to human voice, I wrote, my pencil scratching softly against the paper. The knocks remained silent. My throat felt dry as I cleared it quietly. Hello, I called out, immediately regretting it. The words seemed to hang in the air, absorbed by the darkness. The response came instantly. 3 sharp knocks, closer now, maybe 300 yards. Then silence again. My hands were steady as I wrote, but my heart was hammering. 15 hours. Sounds appear to respond to human vocalization. Distance decreasing. Note, subject demonstrates possible intelligence, ability to process and react to stimuli. I kept my rifle across my lap as I continued writing, documenting everything with military precision. The fire cast dancing shadows on my notebook and I found myself writing smaller, tighter, as though trying to make my presence less noticeable. It feels like someone is listening, I wrote, then underlined it twice. The words stared back at me from the page, and for the first time since starting this journey, I questioned my own judgment in coming out here alone. The knocks didn't return that night, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. It felt expectant, like the pause between movements in a symphony. I maintained my watch until midnight, recording the time and temperature every hour, noting the complete absence of normal forest sounds. No owls, no insects, nothing. 2300 hours, no further acoustic anomalies. Temperature, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Notable, continued absence of nocturnal wildlife activity. Personal observation, silence suggests large predator presence, but pattern inconsistent with known species behavior. I kept my fire small, just enough to see my notebook by. The valley walls had become solid blocks of darkness, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something was up there, watching, waiting. Every time I whispered my notes to myself, I felt the attention sharpen, like a radio signal coming into focus. I woke to frost coating my tent and an unnatural stillness in the air. The first thing I noticed was wrong was my breath. I could see it hanging in the cold morning air, but I couldn't hear it. The silence was absolute, like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the entire valley. 0600 hours, I whispered, reaching for my journal. Temperature approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Dawn conditions, heavy ground frost, complete absence of morning birdsong. My military training had ingrained the habit of securing gear before sleep. Everything had its place. Rifle within arm's reach, backpack at my feet, boots by the tent entrance. But as I turned to grab my pack for breakfast, my hand met empty space. The surge of adrenaline cleared any remaining drowsiness. I unzipped the tent slowly, controlling my movements despite the urge to rush. The clearing looked different in the pale morning light, shadows still clinging to the edges where the valley walls rose up. My eyes swept the area systematically, just as I'd done countless times on patrol. That's when I saw it. 20 feet away. My backpack stood upright, carefully balanced on a broken sapling. The branch had been snapped clean, not torn. The break was too precise for wind or weather. The pack was positioned with deliberate care, the straps arranged neatly, facing directly toward my tent. 0615 hours, I wrote, my hand steady despite the implications crowding my mind. Pack relocated approximately 20 feet northeast of sleeping position. No signs of dragging or animal interference. Placement suggests intentional manipulation. I approached cautiously, scanning the ground for tracks. The frost had formed over any prints that might have been there, but the earth around the sapling was disturbed in a way that spoke of recent activity. The pack itself was untouched, my food, maps, and equipment, all present and undisturbed. This wasn't a bear or a raccoon. Animals raid packs for food, leaving chaos in their wake. This was different. This was a message. I documented everything in my journal, drawing a quick sketch of the scene. Pack contents intact. No theft attempted. Sapling broken at height of 7 feet, clean break suggesting significant strength. Placement indicates intelligence and purpose. The implications kept stacking up, each one more unsettling than the last. Whatever had moved my pack had done so without waking me, despite my light sleep and years of tactical training. It had lifted the pack without disturbing its contents, carried it 20 feet, and arranged it with precise intention, all to communicate. What? 0645 hours. Working hypothesis. Subject demonstrating awareness of human presence and capability for complex manipulation of objects. Evidence suggests deliberate communication attempt. I found myself whispering as I wrote, then caught myself. After last night's knocking response to my voice, I wasn't sure I wanted to provoke another interaction. The morning silence felt like it was listening, waiting for my reaction. The pack incident bothered me more than if I'd found my supplies ransacked or stolen. Theft would have been natural, explicable. This careful repositioning suggested something else entirely. Intelligence, purpose, and most unsettling of all, restraint. Whatever was out here wasn't just aware of me. It wanted me to know that. It was aware. I retrieved the pack, checking again that nothing was missing. My fingers traced the straps where something strong enough to snap a sapling had gripped them. There was no damage, no tears, just that same deliberate care that made my skin crawl. 0700 hours, I noted. Temperature rising to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. No visual contact established. No further acoustic signal since last night's knocking sequence. Personal observation. Subject's behavior indicates calculated interaction rather than territorial display. The sun was higher now, burning off the frost and gradually returning normal sounds to the forest. But the weight of being watched remained, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer alone in this valley. I shouldered my pack and pressed on, though each step felt heavier than the last. The morning's incident with the backpack had shaken my confidence more than I wanted to admit. 20 years of military training told me to maintain objective distance, to catalog and analyze. But something deeper, more primitive, whispered that I was being toyed with. 0800 hours, I muttered into my voice recorder, trying to maintain routine. Heading northwest along the ridge. Weather clear, wind minimal. I pulled out my compass to confirm my bearing and froze. The needle swung lazily, as though drunk, before settling 30 degrees west of where it had pointed moments before. I tapped the casing, checked for nearby metal that might cause interference. Nothing. When I took another reading 5 minutes later, it had shifted again. Compass showing unusual variations, I noted in my journal. Possible magnetic anomalies in the area. But even as I wrote the words, I knew they rang hollow. I'd used this same compass through 3 deployments and countless wilderness treks. It had never failed me before. The terrain opened into a wide glade, the kind of place that should have felt exposed and readable. Instead, the stillness hit me like a physical wall. No wind stirred the canopy above, though I could see trees swaying on the ridgeline. No birds called. No insects hummed. The silence had weight, presence, intention. I found myself moving faster, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. The clearing seemed to stretch endlessly, though my map showed it couldn't be more than 200 yards across. Each tree I passed stood impossibly still, as though holding its breath. My boots crunched on dead leaves, the sound unnaturally sharp in the vacuum of silence. 0915 hours, I whispered into the recorder, my voice barely audible even to myself. experiencing significant atmospheric pressure changes, ambient sound suppression consistent with. I trailed off, unable to find a rational comparison. The glade finally gave way to denser forest, but the feeling of being observed only intensified. I found myself analyzing every shadow, every movement at the corner of my vision. My training had taught me to trust my instincts, but now those same instincts were sending contradictory signals. Everything looked normal on the surface, yet felt fundamentally wrong. I stopped to check my bearings again, knowing it was futile. The compass needle spun lazily, settling on what should have been south. I pulled out my backup compass, same result. Either both were malfunctioning, or 0945 hours, navigation compromised. Possible equipment malfunction affecting both primary and secondary compasses. Alternative hypothesis. I paused, then forced myself to continue. Alternative hypothesis suggests deliberate disorientation attempt. The thought had been growing all morning, impossible to ignore. Each sign I encountered seemed carefully calculated to blur the line between natural occurrence and intentional manipulation. The broken sapling with my pack, the selective silence, the compass interference. Taken individually, each had a rational explanation. Together, they formed a pattern that pointed to intelligence and purpose. My hand brushed the grip of my rifle, an unconscious gesture that betrayed my growing unease. I'd tracked men and animals across 4 continents, but this was different. I wasn't following signs, I was being led by them. 1,000 hours, position uncertain due to navigation issues. Continuing northwest based on terrain features and sun position. I kept my voice steady for the recording, though doubt gnawed at the edges of my certainty. Was I still heading northwest? The sun seemed wrong somehow. Too bright, yet providing little warmth. The trees pressed closer, their branches reaching like fingers across my path. Every rustle made me twitch, every shadow demanded attention. I was losing objectivity, and I knew it. The rational part of my mind, the part that had earned me top marks in tracking and survival, was at war with instincts that screamed of hidden watchers and impossible things. Personal note, I added to the recording, my voice barely a whisper now, beginning to question reliability of own observations. Sleep deprivation possible factor, recommend. I stopped, realizing I had no recommendations to make. Every option, retreat, advance, or hold position, felt equally wrong. The forest waited, patient and ancient, as I stood paralyzed by indecision. Somewhere nearby, a branch cracked with deliberate slowness. I built the fire higher than usual that night, telling myself it was just for warmth. The flames cast a 20-foot circle of light, beyond which the darkness felt absolute. My hands shook slightly as I made notes in my journal, the scratching of my pen unnaturally loud in the pressing silence. The first step came at 9:45, a deliberate placement of weight that crushed leaves and twigs. I went still, pen frozen mid-word. Another step followed, then another, moving with methodical purpose just beyond where my light could reach. The sound circled clockwise, maintaining a constant distance. Between each footfall, the silence became suffocating, as though the very air was being compressed. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear the next step, my heart hammering against my ribs. The movement continued its circular pattern, unhurried and deliberate. My hands trembled as I wrote in my journal, no longer the tracker here. Have become quarry. Something is hunting me with patience and intelligence. The roles have reversed completely. The steps continued their measured orbit, and I realized with growing dread that there were multiple sets now, at least 3 distinct patterns of movement, coordinating their movements just beyond my vision. I stumbled over another route, catching myself against a tree trunk. 4 days. Had it been 4 days? My watch still worked, but the time meant little now. The maps were gone, probably dropped. Them yesterday when I'd rushed away from those wood knocks. Or was that this morning? My fingers traced the rough bark as I steadied myself. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford. Every time I closed my eyes, those footsteps would circle closer. The rational part of my mind, the part trained by the army to maintain composure, kept insisting I should turn back. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when every broken branch and twisted sapling seemed to point toward something unprecedented. Getting close, I muttered to myself, the words scratchy in my dry throat. Something extraordinary out here, has to be. But even as I pressed forward, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Fear rode my shoulders like a physical weight, turning every shadow into a potential threat. I checked my compass again, though I barely trusted it anymore. The needle swung lazily, as if the magnetic north itself had become uncertain. My training told me to stop, to rest, to think clearly. But something deeper, more primitive, urged me forward. The ground changed as I crested another rise, the soil turning softer where moisture collected near the ridgeline. That's when I saw them, fresh prints pressed deep into the dark earth. Each impression wider than my boot, and at least 15 inches long. No claw marks, no bear sign. These were bare feet, but massive, with a distinct arch and 5 toes that had pushed into the soil with frightening clarity. My hands trembled as I knelt to examine them. The tracks couldn't be more than an hour old. The edges were still sharp, undisturbed by wind or wildlife. They led uphill into a dense stand of timber, each stride longer than I could comfortably match. That's when I heard it, a sound carried on the wind that made my blood run cold. Not quite a howl, not quite speech, but something in between that. Spoke to the deepest parts of my brain. The vocalization echoed off the ridgeline, a series of modulated tones that couldn't have come from any animal I knew. And yet, they held purpose. Intelligence. My legs went weak. This wasn't discovery anymore. This was a message, a warning. Whatever made those sounds wanted me to know it was there, and that I had ventured too far into its domain. I turned and fled, no longer caring about stealth or tracking. My boots slipped on wet leaves as I crashed through mountain laurel and rhododendron thickets. Branches whipped at my face, but I couldn't slow down. Not now. Behind me, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, wood striking wood. Then another. Closer, off to my left. They were coordinated sounds, too deliberate to be random. Something was paralleling my course, keeping pace through the forest. I spotted a worn game trail cutting across the slope and took it, grateful for any clear path. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder. Dark shapes seemed to move between the trees in my peripheral vision, but I forced myself not to look directly at them. Looking would make them real. More knocks followed, this time from my right. They were hurting me, I realized with growing horror. Steering me down the mountain like a spooked deer. Then through a break in the canopy, I glimpsed it, the metal roof of a ranger station gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Without hesitation, I broke into a full sprint, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. I didn't dare glance over my shoulder, even when the air behind me grew heavy with that same musky scent I'd noticed days ago. I stumbled into the ranger station's gravel lot, my legs finally giving out. The metal door squealed as a deputy and ranger rushed out to meet me. I must have looked like hell, clothes torn, covered in sweat despite the cool mountain air. "Sir, are you all right?" The deputy reached me first, his hand instinctively moving to his holster as he assessed the situation. The ranger hung back, scanning the tree line I'd emerged from. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. The ranger disappeared inside and returned with a bottle of water. I drained half of it in desperate gulps. Something out there, I managed between breaths. Been following me, watching, moving my things. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I fumbled with my pack, trying to show them my journal. The deputy exchanged a skeptical look with the ranger. "Take your time, sir. Let's get you inside first." His tone was measured, professional, the voice you use with someone you think might be unstable. I caught fragments of their radio chatter as they helped me inside. Search and rescue would check my last known location. Standard procedure, they assured me, though I could tell they expected to find nothing but an abandoned campsite. 2 days later, the search and rescue volunteer who led the team called the station. They'd found my camp exactly where I'd left it. But what caught their attention were 2 sets of prints in the soft earth nearby, one approaching the camp, one leading away. The volunteer's voice wavered slightly as he reported their size, nearly 16 inches long, far larger than any known wildlife in the region. The deputy made notes, his pen tapping against the paper with increasing frequency as he listened to the report. I spent 3 days in the local motel before I could sleep without jerking awake at every sound. The doctor called it acute stress response, but I knew better. My journal sat locked in the bedside drawer. I couldn't bring myself to read through those final entries yet. When Sheriff Matthews came by to follow up, I gave him the bare minimum. Yes, I was an experienced outdoorsman. No, I hadn't been drinking or using any substances. Yes, I was certain about what I'd seen. But no, I wouldn't be filing an official report. The knowing look in his eyes told me he'd heard similar stories before, though probably not from someone with my background. "Listen, Mr. Price," he said, adjusting his belt as he stood to leave. "These mountains, they can play tricks on the mind. Even experienced folks get turned around sometimes. Best to chalk it up as a learning experience." I nodded, not bothering to argue. How could I explain the deliberate placement of my backpack, the strategic positioning of those bent saplings, the way the tracks seemed to lead me deeper, like breadcrumbs in a dark fairy tale? Before leaving town, I forced myself to review my journal one last time. My early entries were clinical, precise, exactly what you'd expect from a military tracker, but they degraded over those 4 days, becoming increasingly urgent and paranoid. In the margin of the final page, I wrote a warning I hoped someone might heed. If you find a trail too easy to follow, ask yourself who made it, and why they want you to follow. The local authorities filed my case away under possible wildlife encounter, though the search and rescue team's report about those 16-inch prints remained unexplained. The ranger station posted additional warnings about hiking alone in that section of the backcountry, citing increased bear activity. I sold most of my tracking gear before heading home. Some nights, I still wake up hearing those rhythmic stone knocks, feeling that suffocating silence that comes when something intelligent is watching. The mountains hold their secrets close, and sometimes the wisest choice is knowing when to stop looking for answers. The sheriff's office eventually closed my case, filing it away with other unexplained incidents from those ridges. But they never could explain those tracks, one set going in, one coming out, or why an experienced tracker would abandon his campsite in such a hurry. If this story lingered with you, subscribe. I'll return tomorrow with more.